Dan Morrissey. I'm the Commercial Director of Skanska UK. And I've got the pleasure of being the chair of this fantastic panel of people who will introduce themselves in a second. I sat on the panel talking about this last year, but not as the chair, so they say they promote idiots out of the way, so I'm chairing this afternoon. With that, I will let the team introduce themselves and give us their thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, hi, so let's start with me, I assume. Adriano Amorese, I'm a partner at Mishcon de Reya, UK law firm, in their real estate team. So I'm focused on sort of major projects and construction and development. And I spent a lot of the last few years heavily focused on sort of thinking, writing and advising on the contractual implications of net zero and the circular economy.
Nigel Moss, Group Director at Bourne Group. Nearly 44 years in the structural steel industry. And I just want to share that as a very young apprentice, an engineer said to me, good industry this. Steel, there's nothing you can't build with steel. And I think what I want to share with you is that we can all find the resources, and we've talked lots about the technical and come up with the solutions that we need. What we need to do is just work together and find a practical application of what we're trying to do here. And I think it's wholly possible.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Bill Firth from EMR. I've been developing the reusable steel business for about 3 years now. So we've gone from a team of 1 to a team of 14. We've now got 3 reusable steel facilities operational. And I think from our perspective, we think there's 2 sides to this conversation. There's one on the purchasing from the structures itself. We're also enabling the likes of Nigel as a fabricator to buy from us, and we have to get both right, because if we don't, we can't sell what we've bought.
Good afternoon, everyone. Peter Kelly. I head up the sustainability team at ISG. We're a construction company. Done some small-scale reuse recently with Roy, and went relatively straightforward in terms of the purchase of that, but as Roy says, I knew what I wanted, I had the drawings, I had the money, so it made it relatively straightforward. So hopefully we can pick up on some of that this afternoon.
Okay, I'm Roy Fishwick. You all know what I've got.
Yeah, this is Roy's second sitting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pitted against each other, the 2 titans. Iron Maiden's still ringing around in your head there, Roy. But why don't we kick the discussion off over, general procurement? So we've got a fairly traditional procurement model that we use in the UK. How does that fit in with reuse steel? Maybe Nigel, if you could kick us off with that.
Not wishing to be like Roy, I don't think it does. So I think that we're doing something which is different, so we're going to have to change. And I don't think that change needs to be massive, but we just need to recognise that we need to push barriers away and put in place enablers. Roy touched on it about the availability of the stock. Until we can grow that stock and make it as easy to buy a piece of reuse as it is to buy from a stockist, we need to recognise that we've probably got the best stockist availability in the world in the UK, an industry which has been driven by development and efficiency over many years. So it's a tough act to follow, but just by specifying in a contract that you want a certain amount and not know exactly what it is, and we talked about that a bit earlier, I think we have to have some flexibility and some ambition to make it happen. That's partly to do with early collaboration, finding out what you want, and if you don't know what you want, then create a framework in the contract that incentivises everybody. And I'm not talking about money. I think it's about relationships, and we all want that badge to say that we've achieved this. So just by being here today, I think we're all demonstrating that. So it's about finding some enablers that says, well, if it's 10 tonnes out of 100, or as Harris have done with 100 tonnes out of 3,000, then that's a start, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to enable the start and work together to achieve it.
Okay, that's great. Bill, maybe you can weigh in on that one from a supplier's point of view.
Yeah, I don't think we're short of material. We think there's about 800 million tons of structural steel in the UK, in the urban mine. The challenge is actually bringing that forward. One of the reasons why we entered this space as a large metal recycling business is that we buy around 35,000 tons a month of structural steel sections which are recycled. But what we're competing against are some very well-established supply chains. So if you think the way that construction projects are undertaken, type programs, type margins, risk, very small sort of deliverable profits at the end of that, anything which slightly threatens that is difficult to manage. If you think about the availability of steel sections, stockholders, steel mills, it's there, it's very efficient. And if you then think about the recycling industry as well and how the demolition sector plays into that, you've got a huge amount of inertia to actually change the way that these secondary materials come onto the market. So I think for me, where we are with this is that the huge demand has really been driven by the ultra-low carbon performance of reusable steels at 47 kilos a ton. The benefit is with the organisation using those steels. But I'd like to, have a conversation around, from a whole life cycle carbon assessment point of view, how can we incentivize and reward the extraction and the management of steels from existing structures? So if we leave the steel work in place, could you assume that that's a zero carbon impact? We build around them, we retrofit, we refurbish. If you take them out for recycling, you're looking at a carbon impact of around 700 kilos a ton, which is probably what will happen to those steels, business as usual. If you take them out to be utilized as reusable steels, it's 47 kilos a ton. There's a half a ton difference of carbon savings there. But I don't think that's reflected today. But if you had that reflected within the project carbon budget, and then I think you would see a lot more low carbon materials and different choices made around reusable steels coming onto the market, without damaging the existing stock and bringing forward additional demolition practices.
That's really interesting, the thoughts there around incentivisation at the front end. I wonder, Adriano, whether you can make some commentary on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the commercial incentives are there already, I think, in the absence of government policy, in that we're seeing a kind of two-tier market evolving. Those buildings that deliver on occupiers' ESG aspirations and targets are obviously performing better than those that aren't, and we're ended up with a sort of tier of brown assets which are potentially stranded. So I think that's driving incentivisation forward. I think the absence of a sort of uniform standard, I think the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard will help with this, but the absence of a sort of uniformly adopted standard and system of measurement is sort of hampering that from a contractual. It's very hard contractually to say, this is what you need to achieve in terms of the embedded carbon content or energy performance of a project, but I think it will change. And I think, to the point that Nigel made, I think early contractor involvement is really the key to defining the aspirations of the project and making sure that the allocation of risk is understood and that, the key commercial and technical risk factors are interrogated and properly understood at an early stage in the project. Because veering off on a slightly different point is that, what we see from a legal perspective is that clients and funders, they don't want to depart from what might be considered a conventional apportionment of contractual risk. They want, in other words, the main contractors, as you well know, to underwrite the sort of time, cost, and quality elements of reused steel in the same way as they would if it was a new steel project. And I think that requires early contractor and supply chain involvement.
I think that leads us nicely on to sort of the next topic, really, around liability, risk, and warranties. Maybe, Peter, you could have a stab at that from the main contracting world.
Yeah, as I said, we were relatively straightforward in terms of the case study we did for this Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. It's a small PV canopy on the roof. It wasn't on the critical path. 3.79 tons of reused steel. And it was relatively straightforward because Roy had the provenance of the steel. As I said, it wasn't on the critical path. And in the grand scheme of things, the procurement went relatively straightforward because it was as if we were using new steel, really, with some minor testing from Roy. So no huge impact there, really, in terms of difficulty or challenge, more some not even particularly early engagement with the fabricator because it wasn't on the critical path, so we could do it offline and see if we could achieve it first, even before bringing it to the client. So from a contractor perspective, wasn't particularly challenging and didn't have a cost implication either.
That's a really good point. So that the example you've given there is a fairly small scale example with relatively small levels of risk associated with it.
Spot on.
If we're looking potentially to expand that to something larger, larger content of reuse steel that perhaps has impacts on the critical path of the programme, where do we stand on that?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. Got some colleagues here today that have been grappling with tenders that have come through, as we've discussed today, mostly in central London, which have elements of reuse in them, but they've had early engagement with the contractor, which is definitely key. But it tends to be small volumes because of that risk aversion. The liability issue, as I said, was solved in this particular case because we had very good provenance of the steel, and Roy made it as if it was new steel to the fabricator. But whether that can manifest itself in a bigger project where it is more challenging, then yeah, that is definitely a challenge for the contractor.
Can I just do one point to that, though? Even though it's a relatively small amount of steel, there's a significant saving in the carbon, and I think that's what we're not talking enough about, and that's the goal. I think that's what we should be looking to enable. So I wouldn't downgrade it, but I think also taking those things away from the risk, the critical path, picking the elements that can be done, the way that we should approach it, rather than trying to do everything we do today. We know we're only stealing from the pile, so we've got to get away from that whack-a-mole. But I think it's significant.
Yeah.
I think from our perspective, we're a big scale business. We've entered this market to scale it, and what we were encountering early stages was every project wanted to procure differently. Every project had different T&Cs, and we worked on a project, didn't we, Adri? I think it's 2 years on. I think we're still looking at the T&Cs, and that just isn't scalable. You can't, and I'm sure Roy gets exactly the same. It bounces from one project to the next project to the other project. So we've actually put a lot of time and effort into now saying, what are the risks? How can we manage the risks? And how can we, distribute those equally across the supply chain? So we've come to a much more simplified terms and conditions document, with warranties against the material, and it's in there so that we can sell it in a standardized way. And what we want to do is make sure that there's as little friction as possible so that reusable steel is just considered as a steel product. Exactly what was said earlier. So it's moving away from this, it's too difficult, it's a niche product. There has to be a scalable business model to deliver that, and that includes risk and procurement.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make that purchasing, really simple and clear for the individual that's making the purchase. Roy, I wonder whether you've got some commentary on this, particularly around timing and when people might get involved to buy some reused steel and what's appropriate.
I think, just to pick up on the risk thing first, I don't think most of the risks are different. What's different with reused steel is people try to avoid theirs. So good engineering is good engineering. We're selling the product. We've been insured to sell this product for 50 years. There's no problem with us warranting the product, but then the fabricator has to stand by their work. So actually there isn't a radically different risk profile to the actual process. It's what people want to carry or not, and it does. And I've seen it, and it slightly amuses me when somebody's got a donor building and they want to have the material come out of that building, send it to somebody to have something done to it and take it back, and somehow it's no longer their material. Well, they supplied it, so ultimately they must own the risk to that material. That can't not be true. but it's actually no different in any other way to normal supply. But in terms of the timing, and this is a realisation over time, we want to help every project we can get over the line because we want to see the market grow, and that's understandable. But if people are coming to talk to us before they've got a fixed design or before there's any actual money available, then I've had material on reserve for 9 months and more that still hasn't gone anywhere and may never, because the other thing is people go away to do their work and then forget to tell me that the project's changed completely. So increasingly I'm of the opinion that we have to have a conversation when decisions can be made. And I choose those words carefully because if you've got budget and a deposit for an option or whatever snazzy thing somebody might want to do, then that decision can be made at that time. But if you're not going to have any money or commitment until the contractor's appointed, and the contractor hasn't been spoken to anyway, then those conversations need to happen right at that end. And I know that doesn't sit well with people that are trying to sell reuse at a particular volume in a particular project, or carbon at a particular volume in a particular project. You can't sign contracts and do deals until you're in a position to sign a contract and do a deal. And I've seen some strange manoeuvres to try and get around that, but it doesn't work. I'm happy to hold material in good faith. We do it for piling contracts all the time. It's not unusual for me to have to wait 6 months or 9 months to get material out of the yard. But I know at the start of that at the end of it, it's going out with the greatest balance of probability. And at the moment in reuse, we're not seeing that particularly or at all.
Can I just pick up a point on terms and conditions? Bill mentioned his terms and conditions. I'm very au fait with them and I've traded with Roy, and just want to share with the audience really that their terms and conditions aren't any different to the terms and conditions that we have from ArcelorMittal or a stockist supplier in the UK, and the material's no different either. And the reality is that we get quality issues very rarely, but we do get quality issues with new materials. The good news is it normally, ordinarily always comes out in the fabrication process. If you've got a problem with a piece of steel, when you put some heat to it, it will show you it's got a problem. And then we reject it and it gets replaced, which will be exactly the same with these guys. Secondary issue that they may not have 1 million tons of that to replace it with, but again, if you're talking of one piece, it shouldn't be the end of the world to replace it with new if you have to. So it's all possible. You know, it's not difficult. The thing is that we're perceiving risks and we're trying to move risks. They either shouldn't be there or we don't need it to be there to enable us to do what we want to do.
Yeah.
I think, Dan, that's a really important point, this idea of perception of risk. And, you know, what you said is encouraging about, you know, suppliers signing up to the same terms. And actually what Roy said about the risk factors not being greater in relation to reused steel than they are with new steel. Because I think what needs to be understood and what's really important as a takeaway is that clients, funders, interested third parties, they don't want to accept any sort of change to the warranties that you would usually expect to get around quality and performance of the product. And I think there's an education piece where we need to dispel this idea and this perception that reused steel carries those risks, because if that then translates into contractual positions which are viewed as suboptimal by the market, it's just not going to get the traction that it deserves. And that's critical, I think.
No,
And whether it's new or reused, we're supplying it to a specification. So we've talked about that earlier today. And we're quite happy to give warranties the same as everybody else. We'll give warranties against that specification and the compliance with that specification. No greater risk. We deal with that risk within the testing and the provenance and the certification that the materials come to us from the suppliers like Bill and Roy.
So I think, Dan, just to follow on from Roy's point about stock and when to buy, when to sell, when to hold, we've actually started to do so the engineers within the structural reusable steel team that we have, we just started to look at the requests for sections. So it's actually interesting that about 60% of our requests are for 25 section types, just 25 section types. So it's really interesting now. So what we're looking to do is that our purchasing is now starting to be informed very much on what's being requested. We don't want to be holding lots of exotic sections that will never go into a structure or will be difficult to move. So it's really, from our perspective, what we're looking to do is getting much earlier, and some of the things that Christian talked about this morning around assessing, buildings, when demolition's not even been considered. What does your portfolio look like? What does your assets look like in terms of structural steel work? What sections are in there that have the potential to be reused within your projects, but a wider projects really? And then the urban, instead of just panning for gold and hoping for the best and seeing what comes through, we'll get to the point where ultimately this will become much more efficient. And then I think, going back to that procurement piece, we've, and I'm sure Roy's exactly the same, looking at the business as usual models, the levers we can apply, we can work with the demolition contractors as we do. We can offer them more value for the sections coming out to try and compensate for additional time and additional resource. But when a program's fixed, when it's locked down, it's really, really difficult to do. Early involvement is really key, but I think what will really swing the barometer here is not only additional value, but in terms of recognising the carbon benefit from those sections being made available.
Right.
Yeah, just to pick up on the scrap side of things, because it's a very sort of minor but very practical issue. Scrap's a commodity that's dealt with in a single sentence typically. A lot of demolition contractors will have a scrap contract with a particular scrap operator that's perhaps 12 months long, or certainly specific to a contract. It also tends to be written so it maps the scrap price in the market. If you then want to sell material or ask your contractor to sell material for reuse, they have to sell it almost piece by piece. Now, we're trying to deal with that again on an indexed price basis, but most scrap leaves a site without anybody even thinking about it, truthfully. So you are disrupting when you ask for things to be reused, and it just has to be considered. It's not a big deal, but the scrap is a cash revenue for the demo guy usually. So if you're not going to let him have it, he's going to want the money for it, but also you're going to disrupt the process. And then on a much more petty but not really basis, sometimes scrap is literally dealt with by the guys on site, and it's dealt with locally. In the same way you buy concrete from the local guy, you don't typically ship scrap half the length of the country. There's a lot of very informal networks where Bill on site sells it to Joe that's 50 yards up the road and he drinks with him every Friday night. And you might think that doesn't account for anything, but it really does. I go back to the point people are making, it's all doable, but some of these daft little things are things that trip you up. You just have to make sure that the process has been prescribed and understood before you just make the sort of almost blind request that we want some of this stuff reusing, because it'll be upsetting people's own little microclimates.
So I think if there was as much scrutiny as there is on the use of low-carbon materials into structures, as the consideration around materials already within structures by the asset owners, I think a lot of those poor behaviours would go away or would self-correct. So I'd really, and is Will still in the audience, but I'd really, this conversation around reflecting the carbon benefit at the point of horizon within the whole life cycle carbon assessment, I think it's a really interesting piece.
I agree. Hopefully we'll get some questions around that and we'll discuss it a little bit more in a minute. Have you got any views on that, Adrian?
My only view on that would be, so listening to what was being said, that I think, we live in a digital age, so looking for, obviously this is not good for now, but, this is looking ahead. You would hope that the provenance of materials and the value of the stock that's within a building that's about to be demolished could be much more easily ascertained by looking at like a digital model, BIM, a digital twin, and that individual components will have digital information attached to them, which will make this a much more seamless process going forward. So you won't be panning for gold, to use Bill's expression.
Just to pick up on that, though, I mean, I always call it my Gerald Ratner moment, so I don't want this in print. But our business for 50 years, thank you, has been selling people something they never asked for. Because in the reclaim market, you're not under control of what arises. You can't order it. You can only buy what comes up. And we're not far enough in at the moment to know exactly what that is. So most of the models are already designing flexibility in. And that's got to be the case, because I might have to sell you something that's slightly heavier, slightly different grade. But for the 30-odd years I've been doing it, we sell pipe that almost never is what people ask for. The fundamental is that they know what it is by the time we're selling them it, and it's known that it works. So we do pan for gold and we do speculate, not completely irrationally, but we do it. But that's because otherwise we end up with nothing to sell, because people are only asking us for specific things and we don't have them.
But when you scale that up, though, will that end up in a situation where if you want to use, entirely reclaimed steel on a structure, you will have to, the design process will have to be adapted to that, basically, because you will have to know what you're working with before you can design effectively, rather than designing and then hoping and then going shopping for the products.
I don't think you're going to get there, are you? I think it's the boss versus the EAF. It's the 30/70. Reuse is never going to be a 25 or a 40, is it? So
Yeah,
I think there's a definite upscale. You're right. Keep the sections that can be used, will be used in a regular basis, and create a market that works, rather than trying to create something which is a unicorn to a certain extent.
Yeah, so if you think about, so we want to build stock. If we build stock, we can move away from this project hand to mouth, everybody scrambling around for sections. So, we're very interested in building. That's why, looking at asset banks, looking at what's in the built environment, we're very, very keen to do that. We would love to forward buy buildings and structures and have those as an option. But I think in terms of, if you look at, I think where we see reusable steel is the carbon difference, as Nigel said, is so transformational, 98% lower, that even a relatively small amount of reusable steel into a scheme can make a huge difference. It's disproportionate in terms of the impact. So if you're including 10, 15%, that's great. I know that working with Kai at Multiplex, we're always sort of pushing the boundary, looking for more and more, but if we start somewhere, even the difference is considerable at 10, 15%.
But just picking up on a couple of those points, surely we need to be a little bit flexible, because, again, a relatively small example, but Roy didn't have exactly the sizes I needed, but it took our structural engineer maybe a couple of hours to tweak the design to suit what Roy did. So I think, coming back to your point, if you push it around the carbon, you might not get the 80% reused steel, but if you can adapt the designs from the structural end to what you do have, and everyone's willing to do that, and in my instance, it wasn't particularly difficult to do that, then surely will work too, to that flexibility, build that flexibility.
I think you're right, Peter. I'm not an engineer, and I'm in a room full of engineers, so I've got to be careful here, but the engineers in my team tell me that they're called universal columns, and they're called universal beams for a reason, because they're universally applied within projects. So absolutely, we're looking at substitutability in terms of sections. What's the next one up? Around the work that Laura's kind of done. So it's can we get the exact match? Great. If we can't, where can we go next? And it will always evolve. But I think and hopefully from an engineering and architectural point of view, hopefully it could be interesting in terms of having to go back and look at the redesign and look at the opportunities around using these different but similar materials effectively.
I think just to pick up on that, though, the other thing which I've found I've done twice recently is draw a line in the sand, where I've actually requested the customer stop looking. We've got this list, let's work with this list. Because if we just keep coming back to it, we're never actually moving forward. It's just going around in circles. And I'm sure there's somebody somewhere really enjoying doing all the calculations, but in practical terms, we've got to move the job on. So you've got to have the feedback loops. That's unquestionably the case. I think also there's got to be a recognition, be it a date or a quantity or whatever it is. There's a line in the sand. Everybody's happy with this as an outcome, and then make the agreements reflect that. And it can be the case that a job can actually be flexible enough to say, and Holbein Gardens did this with us. I was able to say, right, I know the list of stuff you want. Oh, I've got some more of this now. Would you like that added in? And we were able to just add it in at a rate. We'd agreed the basic deal for that, and it wasn't necessary for them to have the absolute nitty-gritty of the detail to do that going forward. And then on other jobs, I've seen it where they actually want would-be class as execution class 3 traceability. So they're telling me which piece of steel they want from my stock, and it has to go in this particular place in the building. And that's a bit chancy, because until we've assessed the holes in the attachments, it's not guaranteed that, although it looks absolutely perfect for that on paper, that it's going to physically achieve it. That's another layer of complexity. So you definitely need contractually some certainty that is the baseline, or possibly just the line, full stop.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. It sort of comes back to what's best for project in that scenario, doesn't it? And the balance between not just the carbon piece, but the time, cost and quality, and at that point in time, what's best for the project delivery.
Well, the project specifying something that's not available, or trying to pass the contractual risk for that as far down the chain as you can, is not going to get us to net zero, and that's the point, isn't it? I think.
No, you're right.
It's a bigger picture.
I think, yeah, Dan, so this is, sort of, again, slightly off on a tangent, but one of the issues that I perceive is that's different with reused steel is that it's often the client who's entering into the purchase agreement with you guys, isn't it, rather than it being done through the medium of the contractor or a member of the supply chain who could probably afford to be a bit more relaxed and philosophical about these things. But when it's the client in the seat and they're negotiating with the supplier, I think, nervousness around the suitability of the product for the actual scheme, because they're kind of the intermediary, and whether or not the contractor is going to accept that without any issue, all become issues that come to the fore, as does, the requirement to make advance payments or make deposits, and how that's secured by way of bonds maybe, or vesting. And all that stuff gets mixed up and it sort of confuses the process.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, fortunately that's evolved, and that's changing and improving now, because for us, the easiest sale to make would be direct to a fabricator, to Nigel, so Nigel comes to us as a reusable steel stockholder. When you know yourself, if you go through a client, selling to a client, you're going right down the chain, and the agreement has to navigate all the way through, and the complications around doing that. So if we can build stock, if we can give Nigel sufficient confidence, the easiest sale is for Nigel to call it off through us, and it's done on a sales order basis.
I think that needs to be the next evolutionary step. And I look forward to reading your standard terms and conditions, Bill.
I'll send them through, free of charge.
So just quickly before we move on to questions, are there any other challenges outside of what we've spoken about that you see in this, the purchasing process around this? We start with
No is the
Nigel.
simple answer.
No.
No, I think it's relatively easy to do, as Bill said. Depending where you're dealing in the chain, there are different perceptions based on understanding, really. Yeah, but from a fabricator's point of view, with the right specification based around the 427, no problems whatsoever. As easy as buying from a prime source.
I think as a reusable steel manufacturer, we have to make it as easy as possible for people to use the materials and not increase the risk profile and not increase the cost and deliver all the carbon benefits. Really easy when you sort of lump them together. But I think what we're looking to do are things that we think will help. So we're looking at we have a grading system now, so you can call off our reusable steel on a specification. So instead of it being a bit of a pick and mix and what do we get and it's all poured over individually, you can order it according to a grading system from an architectural, from an engineering perspective, so we can maximize the use of all the sections. And then it's around the provision of digital information. How can we get digital models to Nigel so that he can upload them and see where the previous connections have been? And then how does that go into the material and the product and the project passport so that we have that legacy as well? Yeah. So it's a really interesting blend of business as usual. We have to compete with that, but also we need to do more as well to make this stick.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I really agree with your point about making it simple. We made it so simple for our fabricator, a relatively small company that subsequently have gone bust, which is a real shame. But
reusable steel project.
I don't think it certainly wasn't our project. But yeah, I mean, we made it so simple for them, and they said, well, we haven't done it before, but we're not worried. As long as you give us the certification, if you want this steel, there's no skin off our nose. If you give us all the right certification, all the right, and it's cost competitive, then it doesn't make any difference to us. So between myself and Roy and our structural engineer, they couldn't really say no. And even we were a bit surprised when I turned up on site and it was all there, and you were thinking, well, are we going to get some pushback that we're not aware of? And suddenly you turn up and take the picture on site and it's all there.
I think, just to pick up as well, I mean, it is, as far as I'm concerned, it's our job to make it simple. That's what we're there for, otherwise we're not doing anything. Now, simple is different things for different people. But I think in terms of contractually, you've got to consider when you're thinking about reuse, who is going to be contractually involved. Because I've definitely had 2 jobs where I can guarantee you they've spent more money on lawyers than they have on metal. And I think there's a bit of and there's a bit of a propensity for somebody to say, I'm not really sure how to do this, we'll ask the lawyer. Well, that's like open ticket, happy days. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. In fact, it definitely doesn't have to be that way. So just make sure, goes back to a point I made earlier, be aware of the commercial contractual aspects and just make it fit where the contract should sit.
Okay,
I'm feeling very self-conscious at this point. But no, I agree with everything that's been said. I think for me it comes down to the perception and the education piece. Yeah. And I'm really encouraged by everything that I've heard so far in the discussion, you know.
That's good. Okay, well, I think we'll move on to the questions on Slido. I think really good discussion, hopefully dispelled a few things that perhaps people have got flying around in their heads there. So I'll just move over here so I can read them
Will's
out.
first.
Oh, here we go. Okay, why are the other UK stockholders not following your example? Who would like to take that one to start with?
Yeah, it's a completely different supply chain. So you know the UK steel stockholders, they've been around for 150 years. You know they act as a real value add to the steel mill industry in terms of holding stock, holding different ranges and sizes of stock, and then allowing people to design using their materials. But they're buying it from steel mills. Yeah. It's a whole different scenario in terms of buying it from existing structures and existing buildings. And we found that, you know, we can go into a building and buy reusable sections and buy sections to be recycled. And we, you know, on some projects, we might get 80% reuse. Some projects, we might get 10% reuse, and we have to recycle 90%, which we're fortunate we can do because we're a big metal recycling business. Yeah. So how would a steel stockholder try and match and manage that level of risk? But it is fair to say that we are in discussions with stockholders about selling to them, so that they're seeing us as a provider of effectively we're an urban mill. So I think that's probably why they're not in it at this moment in time.
Okay. It's also selling it, and this is back to another quote years ago I made that got me into terrible trouble with our prime steel businesses, because you can sell. I once said you could train a pigeon to sell their stuff, because essentially people ring up, you tap in the computer what the size is, it tells you what the price is, you tell the customer that's what it is, happy days. Reuse isn't like that. The very second you make an inquiry, we have to start providing you with information about that material. Now we're still back to trying to make it simple, but there is a whole dialogue and a technical understanding that's absolutely critical to sell reused material correctly. And truthfully, it doesn't exist with new. You can just tell the guy that's from you, you've got the certificates, send him a copy, happy days, off they go. So it's I've always said with what we're doing, it's proper selling, because you really have to understand the requirement of the client and then make sure you've met it.
To a certain extent, and I don't know if the steel producers would agree with me, but I see that also the UK steel stockholding industry provides another function as well. It's a buffer between the construction market and the steel mills. If there wasn't that buffer, you'd have steel mills that were being switched off every other week, and it's not a very easy task to switch a steel mill off or switch it back on. Yeah. So there's got to be somewhere for that product to go, and that's why it's developed so well over the years.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, we go to the next one. What is the carbon saving of reuse? Is it the carbon saving according to EN 15804, substituting primary steel making, or the saving of not remelting it?
Yeah, so
When you
we...
sat there
Any
or
thoughts?
Yeah, so I think when we started our reusable steel journey about 2 years ago, we were thinking, what's a key piece of information we can provide that not only to the market but to ourselves? And what we did was we did an EPD, so I think it's still the world's first EPD for reusable steel. So we did the full life cycle analysis, and quite fortunate that we'd already mapped a lot of our processes within the core business. So we ended up within, it's full, A to D module, so the whole operational boundaries in there. If we look at the A1 to A3, which is really what people look at in terms of embodied carbon and reporting, we're about 47 kilos. So per ton of 47 kilos of carbon equivalent per ton of product. So if you compare that against, as Roger was saying earlier, 2.4 ton down to ArcelorMittal's 300 kilos per ton of ex-carb material, it's a significant saving in terms of carbon.
I know where this question's coming from. There's a big issue as far as I'm concerned, just in perception terms and standards.
Yep.
So we're at the moment, we've got an LCA. We were getting the LCA converted to an EPD. The EPD regulations have recently changed somewhat, and I'm not going to pretend to understand it all. But we've now got verifiers falling out with each other about how different elements of reused and repurposed material can be accounted for. I think in terms of the reuse sections, which most people are interested in, it's more straightforward because most of it's second-hand, which makes it more clear that that hasn't got any primary carbon attached. But then it comes down to the Module D type assumptions, and I'm not qualified enough to discuss it all. But right from when I've been involved with this, there's the almost layman's approach, as I would consider it, which is you've definitely saved the carbon from recycling because you've stopped it being recycled. But the standards and the legislation use an EPD, which we got the same number pretty much within 10 kilos.
Right.
And I think fundamentally we have to operate to the standards because it's the only defensible position. It's no point taking the layman's view when you can't then substantiate it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was good discussion. I was hoping Will's question would move a bit further up, actually. If anybody's found his silver rotating pencil, then please hand it in. I'm sure he'd like it back.
That's the one question I can answer.
It was you that nicked it, right. Thank you, it's at the top, brilliant. Andrea, what advice would you give to a client now who is at early stage design and has aspirations to incorporate reclaimed steel but do not have their own supply?
I would say that the case studies that are around here today are really important for clients to give them confidence in that this has been done before. So that would be, to anybody out there, I would say, show what's already been done. Show that this is not, there's many examples of this now, not just one-off example, there's many. So there's, as we all know here today, there's plenty of people involved that can deliver for that client, regardless of structural engineers or stockists or contractors, etc. So that would be my first take. For the particular example that I've worked on, we didn't actually tell the client. We worked through it first to make sure it would work, and then only when I had it buttoned up and knew it was actually going to fly did I then present it to the client. So it made it so simple to say yes because we had it all lined up. There was really no excuse. There was nowhere to go. We'd been through the process, and we had all the paperwork, etc. So it made it easy for an easy yes. But when you're starting out, my advice is come and talk to the experts, really. They're all in the room or sat up here.
Yeah, brilliant.
Sorry, it's just one of the things with that is one of the reasons that the market is disrupted currently is trying to reassure clients. So it's people who want to be able to let the clients choose a number, a percentage of reuse, and then be confident it's going to be delivered later. So really, not that it's very helpful to me, one of the most important things is not to overpromise and not be too exact. Yeah. Because of the case studies, because the business is happening now, we're not in a position we were in 5 or 10 years ago where you could ask for the best circular economy outcome, and in the back of your mind know damn well the contractors were totally going to ignore it and just tell you why it couldn't work. because they're in a much less defensible position now if they just say it's not possible. Both of our inventories are there to see. So if somebody tells you they can't find any sections that match, it's going to take 2 minutes to prove that's not the case. I think the market's much more engaged, so it's important not to get carried away with the promise, but make a small commitment with some flexibility to increase it.
Yeah, I'd just simply say be ambitious, don't be prescriptive, and talk to people that can help you and move it forward.
Yeah.
So is the message to the market that there are no concerns around availability of supply as long as there is flexibility in design and realistic demands?
Realistic demands, because if we don't know what you want, we can't say that we've got it. But the minute we can help you match your desire with what's available, can't we? By
But is
putting
there
all
a
the levers
limit,
around
though? Is there a limit in terms of the availability of supply? Because I think that's the question that a lot of clients are concerned about.
Yeah, I think on the floor, ready to sell, absolutely. In the urban environment, ready to extract, no. There's the challenge.
Yeah.
So, most of my work 2-3 years ago when we started this was talking about who wants to buy, and that demand is off the scale really, just because of the carbon potential. The focus now is about where can we extract from. So we're applying lots of effort around this part. If we're not careful, this will unbalance the reusable, and it just won't grow. So we're spending so it's a great question from Andrea, but what we're actually saying to clients now is, yes, you would like to buy a reusable steel from us, but we would like to extract reusable steel from your assets in a way that's balanced and works for you.
Right.
And then we have that virtuous flow. But yeah, simplistically, if we've got it in stock, we'll match it and we'll sell it to them.
Yeah. Because the sense I get from what Roy was saying about premature ordering of products and you having to sit on products too long, I think that's born out of a paranoia that there isn't the availability of supply there. And people are desperate to
That's right, and
adopt.
it's creating poor behaviours, really, because it just creates this. So, we want to get to a point where it's having to be done very differently. We're recovering materials, and our mill is what's out there. And that's a very different proposition to going to the conventional route. But in time, that will grow.
It's good. Good discussion. I think we'll move on to the next one. They're moving up down the board at the moment. So there's one here from Zoe. Oh, no. Some bloke called Steve Gilchrist asked a question there as well. When purchasing reused steel, which party takes ownership of related emissions? Okay, so this is about where's the carbon measured, I think, in transport fabrication, especially if it's changing multiple hands multiple times. How's that? Perhaps that's one.
Well, if so with our EPD includes demolition, so it includes the extraction. We had lots of debate about this, and we had some feedback from others, and I'm sure Roy's probably getting some from his own, but we included the sourcing phase within that's our A1, so that's how we extract the material from the urban mine. Yep. So our EPD goes from sourcing, demolition, transport through to us, remanufacturing, which is cutting to length, shot blasting, and then it stops there at the gate. So it's comparable to as Walter said, it's not. You'll be careful not to read directly across, but it's the same operational boundaries as a steel product being delivered to a fabricator. So the 47 is at the point that it leaves us, goes to the fabricator, they will add on their carbon impact to it, and then that becomes the carbon intensity of that product when it's installed in the building.
Right, brilliant. Okay, so the next one then, this is from Steve. Is doing small bits of reuse today typical of where we need to get to when it comes to procurement models for mass scale reuse? Ownership, vesting, warranty. Who wants to say that one? Adriano, go for it.
I'll have a go answering that. I mean, I think it goes to Bill's point that it needs to be frictionless and scalable, the model, doesn't it? And so, Steve and I, Bill, have had attempts at doing this in the past, and we've probably overcomplicated the process by virtue of bringing the wrong people to the table, probably too early in the process. Could have had less people around the table. It appears I was the redundant party at the time. I'm only finding that out now, though. I've lost my train of thought, but I think...
Heckled.
Yeah,
You got heckled, didn't you?
I think, by doing that, we've learned valuable lessons through trial and error. I think in the fullness of time, I think this will just be in people's muscle memory. It should be, we want to reuse steel on this project. This is the process. And it comes back to the point around standardisation as well. And to the point around, you know, this perception of risk in education. I think people think, oh God, it's something new. It's a low embedded carbon product. It's maybe lumped in with the same category as like timber. As a potential, it's different, so we need to think about it differently. But actually, unlike timber, I think this is an area where established procurement models can lend themselves actually quite well to the process, like two-stage contracting.
Yeah.
You know, what have you.
I also wonder whether small scale at the minute is also because our buildings aren't designed for disassembly, reuse, etc. And I think as we grow in terms of our understanding of how we can do more, we will then start hopefully designing back in again to the buildings to allow us to harvest more of that material for reuse going forward. I mean, somebody already mentioned that some of the demolition contractors don't cut at the same angle to increase the size of the beam. So that's already one lesson that hopefully the industry is learning, and I'm sure there'll be more that will help scale this.
Yeah, and we've got, you know, reusable steels going into project now where, you know, they're actually being included within the BIM model, QR coding the sections. So it's a bit like the wild bird that's flying with a ring round its leg now. We know where those sections have gone. We know the legacy and the history. So we'll be knocking on those doors in 45 years' time saying, hey, if you're going to redevelop, I won't be probably knocking on those doors. but in terms of it's building up that legacy and understanding as we go forward.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. This is from Marios. As sellers of materials, do you try to stick to the 80-80 rule of percentage utilisation and percentage length, or do you leave that to the designers?
It takes care of itself. If you want to buy too much from me, I'll charge you. I'm not even really joking, but there's this issue of utilisation. But truthfully, as a stockholder, I can't let you have a 6 metre piece out of a 10 metre length and swallow the offcut. And it is a big factor with reuse, is it's not as efficient.
Yeah.
The new production produces length of every blasted detail you could ever want. Reuse isn't like that, so the waste is a consideration. But in truth, as a stockholder, we can't just decide to swallow big waste percentage.
Yeah.
Now, we'd advise that that was what was going on, so we give you the option of having what you've asked for and it being expensive, and this is why. But there isn't a way around it, realistically.
Okay. On to the next one. What are the key cost contributors to the reuse process? What could we tackle collaboratively to reduce cost?
Coatings.
Coatings.
The single biggest expense in making something definitely reusable is getting whatever's on it off, because it's going to interfere with the welding and it's going to interfere with the recoating later. And actually, that's one of the things that's most difficult to warranty. It's got residue coating on. There isn't a paint manufacturer out there going to touch warranting their paint going over the top of it. So it's got to go back to clean metal. Some coatings don't come off at all. Galvanizing would be one, and there's that wonderful sprayed concrete fire retardant stuff that's a son of a bitch as well. Some of it comes off better, but in single price per ton, it's coatings.
Any thoughts on that?
I think you got deconstruction.
Yeah.
Definitely more expensive than the regular methods of demolition.
Yeah.
But in terms of, you know, that being able to be managed in terms of there is additional value generated from reusable steel. So hopefully can we get to it? And you know, and the guys in the audience from, you know, McGee's, Deconstruct, Cantillon, Keltbray, they're all and I think what's, you know, sometimes the contractors can get a bad, you know, a bad rep for this and you know, not sort of following this. But I think if we give strong market signals that a reusable steel service is the service to deliver, these guys are absolutely experts in terms of undertaking those processes.
Yeah.
So I think those will come down as we become more efficient and it scales. Roy's absolutely right with some of the sort of paint removal, but in terms of actually surveying sections can be really time consuming. That's why we've gone to a digital process now to try and reduce that time and get better efficiency.
I think technology is going to help. So that transfer of data, knowing exactly what it looks like. I think we, as fabricators and connections, we can design around that. I don't think that gives us any insurmountable issues. So it really does depend on what you start with and what you want to end up. But I don't think there's any barrier to that, and it shouldn't necessarily, as Bill's already alluded to, start narrowing it down to the stuff that people want, present it in a state which makes it easy for the next step, and that comes through collaboration and understanding what your customer each time in the chain is looking to secure.
That's great. Squeeze in one more, Steve. Is that right? So we'll do one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Happens to be from Steve himself. Nothing like supporting the boss, right? Talk early involvement, but do we need to be firmer if one wants to review stock or perhaps reserve stock when the design project isn't sufficiently mature? Who wants to go first on that one? We've touched on this a few times, but let's press it again. Roy?
Yeah, it's something, it's a double-edged sword. So if there really isn't certainty it's really not going to happen, that's a massive problem for me as a stockholder. If it's going to happen, then I'm fairly relaxed about allowing commitment. If you go down the contractual route, then if you've got a contract, what you've got is a dispute if it doesn't work, and if you've got a dispute, you've got two parties that don't like each other very much after you've resolved it, typically. So for all that there's got to be firmness, certainly as a smaller business, we're not usually talking values that are big enough to want to go down the whole contractual legal route too hard. And most things, anybody involved in commercials, usually what happens is disputes get resolved commercially rather than legally. So what's it going to cost me to fight it? Am I going to lose the client? So there has to be a clear understanding, there has to be a firm line drawn, but that isn't always going to be in the same place on every job.
I think you're aimed at Roy's point earlier about going too soon, but I think you have to take the right bite at the right time, and I think it's what Tom was touching on earlier. You do one test and you say that looks okay. Do 3 tests and that gives you a different picture. And Roy mentioned it earlier. Don't ask me for 355 if you're giving me 1950 steel, which is definitely going to be grade 43. So I think it's having the right people in the room that you can trust to give you the right qualitative analysis of your next step and your next step and your next step without trying to contractually handcuff anybody or ask unreasonable commitments from people too far down the chain.
Thanks very much. Right, guys, we've run out of time. Sure, like me, you thought that was a fantastic debate. Thanks, Steve. Over to you, and well done, guys. That's excellent.